So we're talking about racism, and in the previous video I talked about the challenge of racism in relation to our individual heart condition and the problem of sin. And we will need to return back to that because that is so crucial and so central to our understanding of the problem. But I want to talk a bit more broadly about the question about whether, regardless of individual attitudes, you can get the problem of racism, systemic racism, institutionalized racism in wider society. And this is probably going to take more than one video to tackle, and it is the one that Christians, particularly conservative evangelical Christians, tend to be the most skeptical of. And so today I want to start to give some background and then we'll flesh that out so that we can help each other understand this. So when we talk about systemic or institutionalized or structural racism, you will notice that people are associating that with some terms that are sometimes owned by people campaigning against racism, but are sometimes used to critique them and sometimes used in a derogatory way. And so the argument that there is systemic structural racism in society has been associated with Marxism and with something called critical race theory, which is a subset of critical theory, and also the idea of white privilege or white supremacy. So we want to talk about them. You may also have heard, particularly in derogatory terms, people accused of cultural Marxism. Now, when we talk about cultural Marxism, the first thing to say about that is you can potentially argue, I think reasonably, that people seeking to implement their particular philosophies will seek to influence the culture. And so if people want Marxism to win, then they will use all means at their disposal. They will use intellectual debate, they will use political means, and in some countries will use armed force, but they will also seek to influence the culture with their ideas. So in that sense, it's not controversial to talk about there being a cultural form of Marxism. However, it's worth saying right at the start here that the specific phrase cultural Marxism has been associated with conspiracy theories that Marxism is itself linked into a Jewish Semitic Zionist agenda and another way of controlling the masses. Ironic, isn't it, that some people regard the Zionists as capitalists and others regard them as communists. That probably shows us that we can't stereotype an ethnic group. So cultural Marxism has in some quarters been used as another anti-Semitic trope to accuse people of being part of that conspiracy. I suspect that most people who use the phrase cultural Marxism are not using it in an anti-Semitic way. In fact, are probably not even aware of those specific connotations that come from some particular historical contexts and are simply talking about the way that a particular political agenda uses the culture to advance its cause. But that is part of the challenge about how terms are used, how they get misunderstood and misused naively, how they can be misrepresented, and how they can be used both to state a theory and idea, and they can be used pejoratively. Let's be aware of that as we continue to talk. But I want to talk specifically about the critical race theory today, just to give you a little bit of background about that. Now, it's not going to be intellectually heavy or deep, because I am doing things in kind of 10 to 15 minute slots on YouTube. But critical theory is the idea that there are power structures in the world that oppress people, that some are favoured and some are oppressed. And it isn't necessarily about individuals and people and their agenda. It is more about the way that the world functions in an unfair manner, though within that context people can start to have their own individual views that may be morally wrong. So critical theory is about seeking to analyse everything critically, but specifically with the critical mindset, the assumption, the hermeneutic, that you are going to find these power structures and that you are going to have to somehow break them down. In other words, you need a kind of revolution. Where does that come from? Well, I want to suggest that it goes back to a philosopher called Hegel. Random place to start. You could probably say that it goes back a bit further, but Hegel's philosophy, not just in terms of his beliefs, but in terms of his methodology, was shaped by something called dialectism. Dialectism is the idea that you reach conclusions, you develop theories and ideas, you get to the truth by setting different extremes in opposition to each other. So dialectic, you can see similar to words like dialogue and that kind of idea. And so Hegel employed this as a technique for coming to understanding, that he would set different ideas in opposition to each other and basically watch them argue one another out. And his theory was that you could get the two extremes. You get the antithesis, so you get the thesis, you get the antithesis, and you progress to synthesis. Not a bad idea, is it? Often in debate and discussion, when it's fruitful and healthy, rather than ideas being entrenched, which is what sadly happens in most debate these days, because it ends up being unhealthy. But when we're genuinely listening to each other and learning from each other, we can reach a consensus, we can reach a new position. And that's the idea. You reach the new position, so you start with your hypothesis, your thesis. It is responded to by the antithesis. There is tension and debate. That leads to the synthesis, bringing the two together into the new idea. And then it repeats itself. So history and thought are circular because the synthesis becomes the new thesis, attacked by the antithesis, leading to a new synthesis, and so on. And that view was developed, and this is where Marxism comes in, because as well as Marxism being a ideology, a preference, a moral choice towards socialism and communism, the idea that the world benefits the most when the proletariat, when the working classes have control, when goods and money and land are shared equally, or even better still, held in common. And that's kind of the political aim. But Marxism is not just a political aim to achieve there, but strictly speaking, the theory is that that is where we have got to end up, and that history, just like Hegel's dialectic arguments, is itself a dialectic process. So you start with one situation, call it feudalism, the thesis, then the antithesis comes in, capitalism, and that will engage and react with the feudalism, and so you will get a new kind of position from there, the synthesis. Societies will evolve and develop, and you will then find that you have a new way of doing things, eventually leading to communism. That's Marxism. Marxism also has in it a historical philosophy that believes that we're not concerned with great individuals in history, but the progress of history through that kind of evolution, which is why you start to see people saying we can tear statues down and not worry about remembering individuals, because those individuals are not as important as we think they are. But that's a story for another day. Well, alongside that ideology, Marxism, both in terms of its theory of how we progress in these kind of power struggles and its aims of getting this, what it believes will be a just and equitable society, you also start to see over the last couple of centuries the development of postmodern thought. And with that philosophical pluralism, and with that the particular ideas of men like Derrida and Foucault, and Roland Barthes as well. And one of the key things there is that language itself, language and writing, fiction and non-fiction, is itself a tool of power. That when we start to make truth claims and fact claims, that what we are actually doing is imposing our power onto others. We are using those truths to dominate and suppress. And so with that comes the idea that you deconstruct language, you discover that it is in fact random, that you can't say things for certain, and that therefore the idea of exhaustive and objective truth is a myth. It's not possible. And that's where your postmodernism and your pluralism come in. And those things, the belief that this world is about a power struggle, that powerful forces will suppress, that humans may not always be consciously involved in making those things happen. And the belief that the primary issue is about power, challenging and overthrowing that power and disrupting it, is what leads eventually to this idea of critical theory. And then when it's applied to race, then it is presented in terms of the struggle between those who have privilege and power, and historically that has been Western powers, colonial powers. And so you have got this white privilege over blacks and other minority groups in Western society. In fact, majority peoples, if you look at the population of the world. The result is colonialism, the result is slavery, the result is racism, and the result is power structures from that slavery and colonialism that still have an effect on the world today, and people are still living under the effects of it. That's the kind of argument. And you can see why people would take a particular approach to trying to change things when you realize the thinking behind it. Now, I want to say at this stage that for a lot of us, if I throw in words like Marxist and postmodernist and names like Marx and Derrida and Foucault and Nietzsche, then your reaction is, as a Christian, is likely to be negative and to see those terms as anti-Christian, anti the gospel, for all sorts of good reasons. And you may be tempted to say, has anything good come out of Marxism and postmodernism, like Nazareth? Well, good questions to ask, and we should not take these ideas on unthinkingly, uncritically. We should challenge and think about them. But we also shouldn't just judge an idea by its associations. We should be looking at the specific claims and arguments in their own right to decide, in the light of Scripture, whether they are true and false. So there's an introduction. Those things will come up more as we look at what the Bible says in later videos. Thank you for watching.